The US and World War One. What were the causes for a war? Long-term edition. Well, the long-term causes were nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and alliances between nations in Europe. Pre-war, tensions were rising anyway. Austria-Hungary was worried about rebellions from Serbs and other Slavic people in their empire. Austria-Hungary was also worried about Russian support for the Serbs. Russia was worried about Germany's support for Austria-Hungary. Basically, everybody was on their toes waiting for somebody to shoot first. What were the short-term causes for the war? The spark for the war was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. This assassination was by a Serb nationalist who wanted to bring down the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Serbia agreed to an ultimatum by Austria-Hungary, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire still declared war on Serbia on July 1914. Russia, Great Britain, and France defended the Serbs while Germany came to the aid of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And Germany declared war on all opposition in August of 1914. What were the long-term causes for U.S. involvement in the war? Well, first, U.S. sympathized with the Allies, and they did not like how Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire were led by monarchs. The U.S. also mostly traded with Great Britain and France during the war, since Great Britain had put a naval blockade on Germany. U.S. also loaned a lot of money out to Great Britain and France. German goods were also competing with U.S. goods, and if Germany won the war, they would gain control of the Atlantic, which would hurt U.S. trade and allow Germany to intervene in Latin America. There was a lot of propaganda in the U.S. about German atrocities. There we go. Atrocities, especially in Belgium, and there was lots of suffering for both citizens and soldiers, with little gain for either side before the U.S. joined the war. What were the short-term causes for U.S. involvement? Well, in 1917, actually all these are in 1917, Germany got desperate and said that they would sink all ships entering British waters. Then the British intercepted Zimmermann telegraph, which basically caught Germany telling Mexico to declare war against the U.S. Finally, there was a revolution in Russia, and Wilson thought that the new Russian government would be a democratic one. Opposition to the war. Most people voted for Wilson in 1916 because he promised to keep them out of war, but now he was calling for us to help the Allies. There was many different arguments against the war. Some said that the causes for war had little to do with the U.S. Some said that U.S. involvement might pit workers of different nationalities against each other. Some said that war was just a money-making scheme anyway, and some thought that war was murderous. However, the unrestricted submarine warfare practiced by the Germans would sway the public in favor of U.S. involvement in the war. So now, onto the decision for war and mobilization. In April 1917, off the back of an amazing speech by Wilson, Congress almost unanimously voted in favor of declaring war. For a year, U.S. involvement was mostly economic. The U.S. provided vital supplies such as food, guns, ships for the Allies. Business leaders, especially Bernard, I think you say it Baruch, explained to countless corporations how they could support the war effort, which led to U.S. factories churning out a vast quantity of war materials. Women and African Americans took the place of men who were fighting the war, and all of this economic opportunity led to a mass migration of African Americans to the north, which was called the Great Migration. Fighting the war. U.S. soldiers didn't arrive at the fronts until the summer of 1918. Fighting was mostly done in the trenches, where the conditions was very poor. And now into deadly weapons. On land, the deadliest weapons were the machine guns and poisonous gas. In the air and sea, submarines and airplanes were the deadliest weapons. Submarines were especially deadly, and the German submarines destroyed a lot of the British fleet. The Germans went for an all-out attack on Paris in 1918, but U.S. troops arrived in time for a huge counterattack, and the Germans were nearly pushed to the border. On November 11, 1918, the Germans signed an armistice and conceded their defeat. Wartime constitutional issues, the draft, and some congressional acts. On May of 1917, at Wilson's request, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, where all male citizens aged 21 through 30 were required to register for military service, and 2.8 million men ended up getting drafted. The Espionage and Sedition Acts 1917 and 18. They were harsh laws that imposed heavy fines for spying/aiding the wartime enemy, interfering with recruitment, or in general speaking against a government action during the war. 1,500 people were arrested during these acts, including the former socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs. And I don't know how to say his name. I think I'm going to pronounce it Schneck versus United States. Charles Schneck was arrested for mailing pamphlets that told men to oppose the draft. He went to the Supreme Court and argued that this violated the First Amendment. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the government, stating that the First Amendment is limited and should be judged based on circumstances. And this raised the question: does this violation of the First Amendment present clear and present danger? Search for peace and arms control. Wilson's 14 points. Wilson had an idealist view for peaceful terms. He wanted to end secret treaties, he wanted to establish a League of Nations to uphold peace, and he wanted to change European borders based on self-determination. Finally, he wanted the League of Nations to be in charge of all colonial possessions. These points were really not realistic. Great Britain and France were more inclined to revenge against Germany since they had lost a lot of lives and property fighting the war, and US had not lost that many lives. The Treaty of Versailles. An overview. This was really harsh on Germany. Wilson slightly softened the treaty, but he still acknowledged that this might lead to a rebellion from Germany. Now, what were the terms of the Treaty of Versailles? Well, first, it dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Empire and made Poland an independent nation. Germany would lose all of their colonies and have to pay $33 billion for war damages. Germany was forbidden to manufacture or import raw materials, and they could not have an army over the size of 100,000. And finally, the League of Nations would be created. As you can see, this is extremely harsh on the Germans. The League of Nations and the US Senate. Wilson had to convince the Republicans in the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. There was two types of opposition to the Treaty of Versailles: isolationists and reservationists. Isolationists thought that there was too many commitments abroad entangled within the Treaty of Versailles, while reservationists wanted to add clauses to the Treaty of Versailles. The chief issue for all opposers was Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles, which they were afraid would end up in the U.S. going into a war that Congress did not approve. So Senator Lodge came up with a clause that stated that the U.S. would not enter a foreign conflict that Congress did not approve of. And the treaty would have actually passed if Wilson allowed for the Lodge clause to be added, but for some reason he said no. So that ended up leading to the U.S. ironically becoming the only world power not to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Reparations and war debt. The Allies demanded a crushing $33 billion from Germany. The U.S. stayed out of these discussions due to isolationist sentiment. The U.S. became a leading creditor nation since they loaned out so much money to the Allies. And the U.S. in the 20s would insist on the Allies paying back at least some of the money loaned to them during the war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was a pact between the U.S. and France in 1928 that invited all nations to declare a common policy of never declaring aggressive war. And over 63 nations ended up signing this pact. But the main flaw of this pact was that there was no consequences for nations that would sign the pact but would not abide by the rules. The World Court. The World Court was a part of the League of Nations that was designed to handle the dispute between nations. The U.S. could have joined this court without even joining the League, but they would continue to deny proposals due to isolationist sentiments in the 20s.